All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. I just want to let everybody know that we are starting the recording of our meeting today. And in just a moment, Ginny Wei from the Minnesota SHPO office is going to do some introductions for us. We'll be starting shortly.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the State Historic Preservation Office, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 40th Annual Preserve Minnesota Conference and the third of 6 sessions. I hope everyone is safe and well. I'm Jenny Wei, the SHPO's National Register Architectural Historian, and I'm speaking to you from my home in St. Paul, Minnesota, the homeland of the Dakota people. I invite you all to let us know where you are participating from and welcome you to acknowledge tribal communities, as Minnesota is also within the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe. There are at least 13,000 years of American Indian history in Minnesota. Other Native nations with ancestral connections here include the Iowa, Ho-Chunk, Cheyenne, Cree, Lakota, and Assiniboine. If you were here with us last year in St. Cloud, you may have filled out an online survey regarding the updating of Minnesota's historic preservation plan or voted for a preservation mascot. For this year's conference, we were going to conclude a year of engagement and forward the draft plan to the National Park Service for approval. However, our timeline has been modified and we have received a year-long extension. There are still ways to engage with this process, and a draft plan will be out for public comment in mid-2021. You can sign up for SHPO's Gov Delivery messaging by visiting our webpage to subscribe. We have all been adjusting to the global pandemic, and our virtual conference reflects those adjustments. While the SHPO team values the networking opportunities we have during our in-person events, we hope that our online series will allow for greater access and participation for the sessions scheduled over the next 2 weeks. Thank you for being part of the virtual conference and joining us from your home or wherever you might be. Computer screens are no substitute for face-to-face, so we appreciate you taking the time to join us. We also encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask questions, which our speakers will address at the end of the presentation. With that, I want to welcome our speakers for this morning's session, Engaging in Place, Working with Community to Define and Map its Cultural Assets. Serena Otaibi is the Rural Programs Manager for Rethos, Places Reimagined. She provides program support to Main Street communities, implements a community engagement approach to preservation, and has launched Artists on Main Street to establish an arts-based community development approach to address downtown challenges and opportunities. Emily Karach-Casey, the Rethos Rural Programs Coordinator, provides support and services to Main Street and Artists on Main Street communities, and is expanding the rural program's educational sessions, downtown assessments, and cultural asset mapping work. With that, I will hand it to Emily.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone. I'm Serena, And I'll first be talking a little bit about our organization, Rethos, Places Reimagined.
Good morning. My name is Emily Karash-Casey. I'm the Rural Programs Coordinator at Rethos, and I'm excited to be here. I live in Winona, Minnesota, so I'm down in the southeast corner of the state.
And then I forgot to mention that I'm in the Twin Cities, although my home community of Granite Falls, Minnesota inspires a lot of the work that I do for Rethos. All right, so at Rethos, we believe that communities flourish when places are reimagined, histories and cultures are celebrated, and small businesses are supported. So we do this work through our various program areas. We have an education program that provides rehab classes for homeowners and home renters to maintain their old homes. So classes such as how to refinish your old wood floors or how to repair your old windows. And also we have, they also provide lectures and other educational content around preservation and old homes. And then we have our community engagement work, which is really a part of our rural programs work. And we're going to talk a lot more about community. That's the focus of this presentation, so I'm not going to touch on that right now. But other program areas that we cover in our rural program work include the Main Street program. And the Main Street program is an economic development program that utilizes historic preservation to revitalize downtown districts. And so both Emily and I implement the Main Street program around the state. And then we also have an Artist on Main Street program where that we implement in partnership with Springboard for the Arts. And that is a program that focuses on creative placemaking, working with local artists who live and work in the community, and then mixing that with Main Street and downtown revitalization. So doing creative placemaking along Main Street. Then we have our public policy work, which includes advocating for the historic tax credit and advocating for Main Street. We also have a real estate program as well that focuses on, the historic tax credit, easements, and other development projects. All right, so diving into community engagement and how we got started with doing this work. So we got started back in 2016 with a grant from the McKnight Foundation to work in 4 neighborhoods in the Twin Cities area. And a part of that work was to engage people, residents, business owners, anyone that has a stake in that community, and engage them where they're at. So there were, we had 2 community engagement coordinators hired at the time, and they actually worked, like they would work in the coffee shop in those neighborhoods. They would go to local events that were already happening to talk to community members. And this whole process resulted and provided 4 different cultural asset maps as a result of all the community engagement. And it was about probably a 1.5 year long community engagement process, maybe almost 2 years. And then the maps resulted, and I'll show examples of that a little later in the presentation. But it was designed to be an alternative to traditional historic preservation, in that we're mapping and highlighting cultural assets that are important to the people who live there now. So the stories, the local businesses, traditions, characteristics. And then if you'd like to learn more about that early work around community engagement in the Twin Cities, Actually, Michael Tolan, who was one of the community engagement coordinators, wrote a great article for the Forum Journal, for the National Trust Forum Journal. And it's called Engaging Communities to Identify Intangible Heritage in Minneapolis, if you'd like to read more about that specific work. So what are cultural assets? And then we just have like more questions, but we're going to dive like really deep into cultural assets and what they are, or at least how we define cultural assets. And so some of the things that we think about or that we ask when we're trying to gather cultural assets are, how would you tell your community's story? What would you say about its distinct character? Now, some of the questions we actually ask probably aren't precisely like this, but these are the things that we ask ourselves as we explore what are the cultural assets of a specific community or area. But all of the answers to these questions are central to sustaining, activating, and promoting that community.
So why do you want to identify cultural assets? Why does it matter? This is such a different way of engaging with folks that it might seem like, do we really need to do this? We've got lists of registers, we've got lists of historic places. But when we are engaging with residents and stakeholders in the districts that we're working in, we're really trying to engage non-dominant or completely new perspectives that have either been overlooked before or they didn't have access to provide their input into the planning and processes that were in place before. It's really meant to bring greater awareness to what's going on specifically in downtown districts. The work that we do is very much centered in downtown cores, not full city-wide maps. We're very much focusing on a precise area, a specified set of blocks. Usually it's what's their zoned downtown area when we're doing this work in rural areas. But it focuses on building relationships between the folks who are doing the engagement process as well as the people who live in the community. But it's bringing awareness around the cultural traditions that exist that sometimes you don't see because it isn't necessarily a physical place. Talking about things that are even just family histories that maybe don't hit that big fancy preservation story because it's maybe just a place that doesn't have any buildings on it anymore, but was really important to the founding of the community. But it's focused on now. So the people who are living, working, playing, even regularly visiting that space here and now, which means that if there's a big shift in a couple years, the information we could gather would be very, very different. In fact, when we are doing engagement work in communities, we often have to ask folks to not think about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, really, really encourage them to think about today, now, and especially with the onset of COVID-19, that has really changed how people are considering what's important to them in their space. So not only are we gathering these stories for tracking assets, we're putting these assets on a physical map. And this map is just your standard GIS map using Esri, but we're able to put stories into this map that the communities then also have ownership of once we're done with the community engagement work, so that they can continue to update this map. While this GIS map is great just to look at and have for posterity to have these stories recorded, it's also really valuable for future economic development as they're looking at maybe zoning changes or a specific type of business recruitment. This map doesn't necessarily tell people doing studies anything new, but it does help validate the information that they already have and helps to give them information on what the community truly does feel like they can support or what they do desire. Cultural asset identification seems, because we're so focused on the now, that it can be a very short-term answer, but it does help to focus on some long-term vitality as well. By being able to focus on some of these small steps, folks are able to take bigger leaps because they're not so nervous to take a big major investment or to make huge sweeping decisions. It's a lot easier. It's a lot less nerve-wracking to make small baby steps and decisions that seem manageable, that add up to a big change in growth over time. So this is the process that we at Rethos follow when we are doing cultural asset gathering. There are other folks who certainly do this work, and their process might look a little bit different. We partnered with some folks at the University of Arizona in Tucson, and their process was just a little bit different than us because the needs of the communities around them were different. So the first thing we do when we're working with a community is determine the area. Most often it's specified by zoning, and we're able to follow that zoning map. However, sometimes there are communities that say, okay, our downtown is so tiny, but the spaces around it are really valuable. Let's make sure we're incorporating certain districts or a couple blocks around it. So we do very much make sure we have clear defined boundaries. Second, we're connecting with community champions. Those are folks who are the leaders that folks name in a community. So it's often their Main Street directors, Chamber of Commerce leaders, city staff, elected officials, even folks who are just those volunteers who are constantly showing up for so many different initiatives, making sure that they're engaged in the higher level of this process so that we can get additional feedback from them and for them to point us in the direction of who to talk to, how to find people, where to go, what time to go places. And then we engage with the community. We'll talk to you in a little bit about the specific processes of how we engage with them. But we just talk to people and we record a lot of data and even things like body language and how people respond to us. We then take all of the data that we've gathered, we review it, and we identify cultural assets. And these are the things that are unique and special about this place that we are defining so that we can map them and also use them to create some strategies for activation for these places. So we create the map, we identify these strategies, and then we share it with the community. And we encourage them to share it widely and loudly. This is something that we don't want to sit on a shelf, that they don't want to sit on a shelf. We're trying to give folks really simple introductory action steps to make these changes happen in a timely manner. Okay, this looks like a lot, but these are the groups of cultural assets that we tend to see falling into these 4 different categories. So the first category that we see a lot are the people. Who are the people in this place right now who are movers and shakers and activating their community around them? And it's not always just one specific individual. It might be the Lions Club is really active in our community, and it wouldn't be what it is without the folks on that group. It can be church groups, wellness groups, special interest volunteer groups, the Humane Society, you name it. It can be any person or group of people, or specific key figures, a mayor, a city manager, a CVB director, truly any person who is in that community doing things now. The second asset group that we break down is the built environment. So this is buildings, it's even places like parks. So it's spaces that have been curated on purpose. It's not your open space with creeks and waterfalls. It can be, but that is more of the environment and landscape around you that was already there to begin with. The built environment is very much human, curated spaces in your community. But we also know that the environment and landscape around you does influence what kind of community you have. What sort of outdoor recreation traditions are there? What sort of wildlife is encouraging people to visit your community or move to your community? Things. We really talk a lot about like nouns and adjectives when we're doing this work. But the things are the stuff that happens in the space. So festivals, the city events, fundraisers, beer and wine tasting events, food, farmers market things, stuff that's happening in that space that is temporary and going up and going down. What sort of arts and creative outlets are there? Do you have a ton of murals in your community? Is there a band concert every week in the summer months? Are there family art events? Is it more fine art that people come and view, or is it art that everybody is engaging in? What sort of creative outlets are there in this space for folks? Economic legacy. So this is businesses that are past and present. There's often, we find in communities, one business that the town was founded on, like this place employed so many people and that's why people moved here. And sometimes that business still exists, sometimes doesn't, but it is so crucial to the identity of that place that it comes up in regular conversation. It is also, what kind of employment is there? Is it a lumber town? Is it a mining town? Is it a college town where a lot of folks are employed in education? Those types of work traditions really help us to come up with some of these assets in the community, because different types of work dictate different types of activity that are happening in districts. And lastly, cultural legacy. We certainly see immigrant traditions of the folks who immigrated to these towns and founded them in the mid to late 1800s. The German heritage, the Norwegian heritage, but also what immigrant traditions are emerging today. Are there folks moving to this town now from places that their traditions are now being enveloped by the downtown spaces? It could even also be religious holidays. Different religions have different big holidays, and how does that impact your community? Are there specific celebrations or decorations that are just part of this cultural legacy of your town? Those are the obvious things. Those are the things you can see, the stuff you can interact with. We also really spend a significant amount of time learning about the invisible assets. Invisible is a little bit of a misleading word, because it's not something that doesn't exist, but it's something that you maybe can't see or used to be able to see and can't anymore. So it's we call them the former icons. So was there a dance hall that burned down that people can't go to anymore, but they remember it and they talk about it and they miss it? Or was there a historic building that was torn down and now it's a parking lot or a strip mall, and people still mourn the loss of that space, even though there's something new there now? Or is it a club that doesn't exist anymore? I know we've worked in communities who, the community band example, there was a community band that played all year long that there just doesn't exist the population to support that anymore. And so they miss that. That group that was always part of the community for a long time. The other part of the invisible assets are these intangible characteristics. These are the it factors, just the things that define a place that you don't see. So they're the adjectives, right? Like they're the things that people say, like, oh, our town is just so creative, or it's gritty, or our downtown just feels really vibrant. We've got this feeling of neighborliness all around us that you can just feel permeating our community. So it's those words that folks use to describe their place around them that is a feeling, how it makes them feel. And that is so important for us to track. That that initial reaction to when we ask, hey, how do you feel about your downtown? What's the first word you think of? Those words are really important to track the overall kind of opinion that folks might have of their downtown district.
All right, and then, so we're now going to go into how we identify all these cultural assets that Emily just went through. And I just wanted to mention, though, I know, Emily, you're talking more of the downtown work and the downtown assessments, which are two distinct. So we have a downtown assessment program, and then we actually are doing a project right now that's more countywide. And so you'll hear later that some of those projects aren't focused on specifically downtown, but yeah, the majority of our work is downtown specific in this case. And so some of the things that are the how we identify cultural assets. It takes a lot of time. I'll say that in terms of talking to people and like the types of people we talk to. And so we talk to folks that are residents, workers, business owners, walking up and down a district in order to talk to as many people as we can, bottom up rather than top down. So, we did mention we identify community champions, but we usually do an initial conversation and meeting with them. But really, we're interested in talking to people that aren't at the table, that aren't the usual suspects, because sometimes what they think are the cultural assets or that are of value to the community, it really does differ when you actually talk to people that are just walking down the street, be patronizing a local business or whatever the case is. A lot of times they have a very different idea of their cultural assets and what's important to them. It does require multiple different ways, and I think we do go through that. We're going to go through curated and organic methods, and then recurring words. So when we talk to folks on the street, when we're just walking around, we have a little notepad, and it's not like we're doing a survey or anything. We don't have a clipboard or anything like that. It's literally like a small little notepad that we can fit in our bag or in our pocket, because when we're talking to people, we're actually not writing anything. We want it to feel like a conversation and not make them feel intimidated that we're going to write anything down that is directly going to make them feel like, oh, what they say might impact something negatively, or that their name is going to stick to it. So all of it's anonymous. And so it's just really for us to take notes after we have conversations with folks, so in between. And we note if we hear words repeatedly. That's how we get those adjectives and those feelings. Basically, if we hear a word repeatedly, then that's a clue to us that that is something to take note of for this community. Same with the amount of places and body language and all of that.
Okay, sorry, this slide is a little tricky on here. Curated cultural asset gathering. This just means that it's planned. Like, we are planning to have these conversations. So we are planning to have a focus group. We are planning to have a meeting with the mayor. We are planning to have an info table at a community festival. We make sure that there are clear outlines and people know that it's going to happen. Right now, with the pandemic, all of our asset gathering is curated right now, just in order to ensure safety, that we are making people feel safe, that we're engaging with, and that we are safe ourselves. That planning aspect is really, really important. These planned conversations, don't always mean that it's an hour-long meeting. It can be a 10-minute conversation, but we just know that we are going to be asking specific questions at a specific place at a specific time. Organic cultural asset gathering. This is the having breakfast at a cafe and talking with the group of people who come there every morning at 7:30 for coffee and hearing what they have to say. It's having a quick conversation with somebody on the street. It's talking to the coffee shop barista. It's sitting at a bar in the evening and talking to the locals who gather after work every single night. They're the conversations that just pop up, and they are so often incredibly valuable to identifying assets because we're able to have longer conversations with people. And they're more willing to bring up spontaneous thoughts than knowing that they are responding to somebody who's doing a study about their space. The lack of this, I think, will be a little tricky going forward, but we're able to do some online surveying that allows for just general input. So we're hoping to capture that now in a different way than we had before, and hope that we can be back out in communities soon. Another way that we engage with folks organically is so many towns have their local Facebook group or message boards or even comments on their local newspaper section that we're able to gather a lot of information from. I know they always say don't read the comments because it gets scary, but we get a lot of information from reading comments sections.
Hey, Emily. You want to share that one story, like my favorite one of the guy that, like the drink?
Oh, yeah. So this was in New Ulm, and I was at the Kaiserhof, for those of you who know New Ulm. That was the space I was at, and was sitting there in the evening, had done a lot of engagement work, ordered dinner, ordered a beer, because we're in New Ulm, you have to have a shelves. And this older gentleman came in and he ordered, I can't remember what the drink was, but it was a drink I had never heard of before. And so I'm like, okay, I've got to ask what this is. And he said, this is the drink when I turned legal drinking age that we came here to the Kaiserhof in the late 60s, and my friend ordered me this drink. And a couple times a year, I always come back here, even if it's by myself, and I just order this drink, and it reminds me of my friends and being young. And those are the stories that are so exciting to be able to capture and are really integral to why something is an asset in a community. So sure, the Kaiserhof is an institution as a restaurant, and it's in a historic building in their historic downtown, but it's stories like these that we're able to capture that are the reasons people care about it in the community, that it's the feeling of being tied to a place that people choose to settle or stay that are important to capture. All right, Serena, I think this one is you.
Oh, all right. Finding themes. So like I mentioned earlier, after all that note taking, that's where we gather all of the info that we've collected through talking to folks organically and through curated methods. And then we literally go through all of our notes, and really it's a way of, so if we hear something and we actually count how many times we've heard something, it's not the most accurate, precise statistically thing that we do. It's basically kind of what we interpret and then literally what we wrote down as something that we've heard, like a particular word over and over. That's how we identify those feelings and descriptions. And then note how important, or not important, I should say, how a place may be, like if a place is referred to often, then we consider that a cultural asset, and we put it on the map. So it's not based on its significance or or perceived significance in the community. It's really perceived based on how often we hear it in people's stories when we talk to folks.
And we're able to gather a little more precise data. When we do online surveys, it's typically around 8 to 10% of the population of a community that responds to the online survey, which is a really great number and gives us some really good data. So we are able to have specific counts of the online survey data and then add that to the conversations that we're having with folks. So once we've gathered all of this data, we've noted these high emotion topics that people have strong feelings about, we've ranked the frequency, we're really able to be realistic about which assets can turn into an action plan. All of the assets go into the map, but the action plan is a little bit more focused. And it helps the community be realistic with their costs of projects, the time they're spending, and the amount of energy that they put into initiatives.
So this is an example of one that came out of the earlier work in the Twin Cities area, so the Logan Park neighborhood of Minneapolis. And this is around their cobblestone street. So this is a example of the actual map that was created, and this is located on our website. All 4 neighborhoods, our cultural asset maps are located on our website. You can check out and actually click on the different categories and see what what cultural assets were identified through that process. You can keep going. And so, like when we mentioned an adjective or description of a place, like grittiness, for example, was named as and we actually label that as a cultural asset for this neighborhood based on the conversations that were had with folks. And it's also an example of one of those invisible or intangible assets. And then the cobblestone street example, this was a cultural asset that was identified and actually was acted on. There was an action item connected to this as a way to preserve this cobblestone street. Because it was through that long community engagement process, it was identified as a valuable cultural asset. City leaders and decision makers made note of that and worked with community members to identify a plan to preserve that cobblestone street versus deciding to just remove it and pave over it. And here's the example. Oops, sorry there. Go ahead. Go to anyone.
So we did a downtown assessment in New Ulm last late summer into fall. And I'm just going to talk about one specific selected action item that we looked at in these next couple examples. So you can see some of the recurring themes that we're able to pull from conversation as well as the online surveys. So New Ulm is really proud of their German heritage. They like that they have a lot of festivals. They like their culture around eating and drinking, and they really wanted to see their downtown state as a space that was celebratory and people were coming down to do things in rather than a lot of services. So insurance offices, hair salons, those are important, but they didn't want all of their spaces in downtown to be focused on services. They wanted to keep some retail and activity. And they also acknowledged that their population is aging and they needed to have accessible opportunities for those folks. The image here is just a word cloud of the language from the online survey when folks are responding to what words would you use when you think about downtown. You can see the different words that we got from folks. the one strategy that we were able to define after lots of conversation, lots of input, was to activate these outdoor spaces in downtown New Ulm. You can see one example here of a great outdoor green space that's just tucked right into the center of their downtown, of which there were a handful of spaces that were lovely spaces that were not necessarily activated or programmed or used as park space. And so the cultural activation strategies we were able to suggest were embrace your German heritage by doing more than just preserving the architecture of the buildings, revamping some outdoor gathering policies. They felt like the folks who were planning events were wishing for some clearer and simpler policies from the city on that, and planning more events into the city center instead of tucking them into event spaces or lots throughout the community, because then that fed into the activity into downtown stores and restaurants, and adding care into the green spaces and parklets that already existed downtown, as they did for the parks in the rest of the city, which were immaculate and beautiful. And you can see the image of this restaurant right on the side called the Lamplighter. And the Lamplighter was a sports bar, but it was in, of course, a historic building. And the owner of the Lamplighter came up over and over and over as a leader in their community in terms of charity and activity planning. So not only is the building itself a really important asset, the owner of this place was activating the green space next to his business. He was donating to charity. He was being incredibly involved in the community. So we were able to learn that while, yes, this building is important, but what's happening in this building and who is doing things in this building is just as important as the building itself. Litchfield was an assessment we worked on early this year, which was altered a bit because of the onset of the pandemic. But the big focus that was really looming in Litchfield was this road construction that was in front of them. Their highway that ran through downtown was about to be torn up and redone, which is a really scary thing when all of your businesses have entrances on that highway. And there was just a big desire from the community to know more about what was happening, when it was happening, how it was going to happen, and if there were ways that they could provide input on options that could help them get through this construction time. So the strategy that we suggested for them was really having a group, their Main Street group, their network Main Street community, take the lead on some opportunities for construction. MnDOT was being really communicative, but the general public maybe couldn't always access that information. So encouraging Main Street to find broad outlets for that message to be shared, and helping those businesses come up with a unified plan, unified signage, even sharing rear entrances of spaces to get into other buildings. And that then helps their Main Street group, which is relatively new, to get off the ground and become kind of a leader and fill the void of some spaces that groups simply didn't have the numbers of volunteers that they used to have.
All right. So I'm now going to talk a little towards the end of our presentation, just mention our Otter Tail County Cultural Asset Mapping project that we're currently in the middle of. This is a project that is funded through a grant through the Minnesota Historical Society's Heritage Partnership Grant Program. And it's actually a combination of our downtown assessment work, our early community engagement work in the 4 neighborhoods, and then also our Artists on Main Street work. So we wanted to try doing this cultural asset mapping work on a county-wide basis. And so it is much larger than just focusing on one downtown or one community. So it is more of a challenge to figure out how do you do it on a larger scale at the county level. And so we partnered, because Rethos, we're based in the cities, but of course we do a lot of work in greater Minnesota, but we partnered with Springboard for the Arts that has a rural programs office in Fergus Falls. And then the Otter Tail County Historical Society is our other partner on this project. And the purpose of this project was to collect and map the stories of Otter Tail County by engaging community members through small projects led by local story mappers. So what's different about this is in our downtown assessment work, we as staff did the community engagement work, working with some local partner, the local organization, but we're doing the majority of that work. So in this case, we're actually asking that local organizations, individuals, local organizations or individuals actually do the community engagement work instead of us doing it, because they know their community better than we do, and we wanted to pay them for it as well. And so we initially hosted back in January when we could host workshops and travel around and whatnot. Luckily, we got that done then, as we were able to host 3 workshops in communities. Oh, and I should also mention, we did identify community champions. So we have also local partners. In addition to the project partners, we have local partners in communities that have really helped us. I mean, we wouldn't have been able to do it without them. Helped us get folks to attend the workshop. So this is a photo from one of our workshops. And help us host the workshop themselves and get the word out about the opportunity and the project, because they don't know who we are as an organization, and why would they trust us or listen or care what we say. So that's why it's so important to find those community champions to partner with and work with, and we always make sure we make that happen. So we don't have, due to the pandemic, originally we were supposed to end that project a couple months ago, but because we had the pandemic basically put a halt on everything because we weren't sure what was going to happen with everything. So back in March, we had to reassess everything, and now we're actually extending it for another year. So this project won't be completed until next spring in 2021. So the map, this is a very early draft version of it. It's probably gonna look very different when we're done with it. And then also a toolkit was mentioned in the description. And so that is in draft form, and that also won't be completed until 2021. But all of this will be on our website once it is completed. And I just quickly wanted to touch on, these are some examples of projects that are underway right now. And these projects were funded, so they range from a $1,000 project to a $2,500 or $3,000 project. And different individuals in different parts of the county have taken on projects to engage their fellow community members. And so we're going to then we work really closely with each one, and they will be sharing all of their stories and data with us. And then we're assembling, actually Tyler on our team is assembling this asset map that will gather everything. And then some outcomes that we anticipate are some different policies and economic development decisions that are made at the county level, or even individually in communities based on this larger map. All right, and again, I want to thank the State Historic Preservation Office and for putting on this conference, and we really enjoyed talking to you all about community engagement. So that's our contact information below. Feel free to reach out to Emily or myself if you have additional questions or would like more information afterwards, but we will pause now for questions.
Yeah, and if you want to see any of the story maps or the final presentations that happened in some of these communities, if you go to Rethos and click on Rural Programs Community Engagement, you'll be able to access all of that information.
Thank you so much, Emily and Serena. This is Jenny again. We do have a few questions in the Q&A since we have a few minutes. One of them was, and I will just quote, it looks like you've done great work in urban and rural areas. Could you speak a little bit about suburban areas too?
Oh, suburban, yes. We personally haven't done a project in a suburban area yet. Not that we wouldn't, but we do have, for example, Shakopee considered suburban? I don't know. Yeah, okay. I don't want to like assume, but Shakopee is one of our Main Street programs. So, I mean, I would assume we take the same approach that we would with any other community in terms of engaging. I don't know, Emily, do you have any other?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting just based on the age of the suburb. So often we're combining, designated historic places with the input of the community and what's happening in those spaces. That I think that would just be one aspect that would be a little bit different, but the processes would be similar.
That actually segues beautifully into our next question, which is from the Crystal at the Golden Valley Historical Society. She says that they're developing a historic context study. Would identifying cultural assets be similar to this, or would it be a deeper dive on assets than the historic context study identifies? So to paraphrase, I think we would talk about the cultural assets and the historic preservation assets context study. How do they work with each other?
Serena, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the difference would be with the assets is very much active now and going forward and how it's used. I'm curious how they define context, though. I think that would help clarify how this would be similar or different.
So this is Jenny again. I do happen to know that the Golden Valley Historical Society is engaging in a historic preservation planning context. So the context development related to Golden Valley and identifying historic assets or historic resources there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it would complement it very well in terms of it informing when you identify historical assets that the stories that you'd collect because the stories that we collect, they aren't like based on, fact or history per se. It's just someone's personal connection to a place, like the story that Emily shared about the gentleman that comes to the Kaiserhof repeatedly, every year. So I think that it would provide additional and complementary context or story to a particular place that would really highlight how valuable that particular asset is today. Because that's really important. That's our main focus, is really figuring out what is important today to people, and how are the assets being used currently and engaged with currently, because that impacts its future use as well.
I think one thing we're able to do, which provides a lot of insight for this type of context study, is sometimes the groups doing research in communities just lack certain connections to groups. Or, for example, the Brown County Historical Society had a really specific idea of what they thought folks cared about and what historic places people cared about in the New Ulm downtown. And while people did not care about the places that the Historical Society noted, they felt stronger ties to very, very different places. So noting that was helpful to them, I think, going forward and how they interact with programming or education.
Great, thank you. We have another question, just how on the finding themes slide, what does SWOT stand for?
Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
Perfect. And another question is, how does the funding work?
Yeah, so for the Otter Tail County project, that's completely grant funded. But for the downtown assessment work, it's usually funded through, actually, the local partner organization, they identify a grant funding source, either locally or not. But for example, the New Ulm one, because they were a designated Main Street community, they used a portion of their Main Street project funding that actually comes from Rethos towards it, and then they've identified additional, like a local foundation grant to supplement it. New Ulm, it was a Blandon Foundation grant. So those are two examples. That's how they were funded.
Thank you. Are demographics collected? If so, how do you go about that?
So demographics are a little trickier to track for the in-person conversations because we're not asking them, how old are you? How long have you lived here? We don't get into some of those nitty-gritty conversations. So the demographics are really only tracked on the online survey portion. But we do ask, how old are you? What race do you identify with? Do you live in the district? Do you live in the county? So we're able to track that, and then it's just in the survey data.
One more, is there a danger of silencing difficult histories by focusing on and thus mapping only those aspects of culture which the community chooses to self-curate on its own behalf as part of the engagement process?
Wow, that's a really good question, because we've definitely talked about that, and especially noting that who we end up talking to when we're at an event or popping into local businesses or whatever the case is, and I'd say yes, I believe there probably is a danger that is not included. And I'm just going to acknowledge that it's not a perfect process, and I still think we need to work on our process to make that better. And I know when we went to Arizona or Tucson to talk to folks there that wanted or were going to do cultural asset mapping, they also asked us that particular question and mentioned how in certain neighborhoods that even bringing up a conversation with someone that brings up a difficult history, because they have a lot of urban renewal and basically removal of neighborhoods. And so how does that get brought up, and how comfortable people are about talking about that and reflected in the cultural asset map. And so, and they've done a really great job of they have the same, the neighbors of those community members a part of their community engagement team and people working on that. So I think that would be one way of going about it. And that's what we're hoping with the Otter Tail project, is that because it's the community members themselves working with other community members to gather stories, that process would create that more, versus us going into a community and missing really important pieces of those stories and the difficult or negative or whatever difficult histories that people don't like to talk about, and so it won't come up. Emily, I don't know if you have anything to add up to that.
Yeah, I think every time we do this, we're able to get in a little bit more and are willing to get more uncomfortable ourselves. We definitely are missing things. No doubt we're missing things. But we have been actively trying everywhere we go to get into places where people who have stories to share maybe cannot access a public space or online. So getting into community centers, schools, senior living facilities, places where people don't always engage in the civic process or have access to get to a focus group or to go to somewhere where something is happening because of childcare or they have to work. And so trying to identify those places in a community is really helpful, but we absolutely, I'm sure, are missing, we're missing things, and we know we are.
There's another question along that line. Do you ever come across conflicting priorities within the community? For example, save a historic building or not save a historic building? And if so, how do you resolve that issue?
Yes. The short answer is yes, we 100% do. I don't know that we do necessarily resolve it. I think we're able to, with the data that we gather, we're able to kind of tap into how the divide maybe happened or find the point where a split took place. But there aren't always ways for us as outsiders to resolve these issues. We can give the community information and resources to make decisions themselves, but we're not always the ones that are able to come in and say, do X, Y, and Z, and this will be fixed for you. It really depends on how the community is able to wrap their arms around some of these challenges.
And we try to really make sure that the information that we did gather, we also have a presentation at the end where we then communicate that information to community leaders. So a lot of times, like in these downtown assessment work, we present it to like the chambers of commerce, city leaders and city staff, economic development authority, like all those folks, so that they hear what people, not them, are saying about their downtown or their community and the different places and how they feel about things. And a lot of times probably all the time, it is new information that they did not know, weren't aware of, or heard differently, and therefore act on different things. So it does, at least if, because we do make sure that they know that it's not reflected on their opinions and what they're saying, because they have a different perception of what's important or what things need to happen. So it's good for them to hear directly. And a lot of times we engage, like in New Ulm, I think we engaged with close to 1,000 people, or like a few hundred. I don't know our exact.
Yeah, and that was just in person. That doesn't count their online engagement.
Y'all are segueing beautifully. Thank you for teeing these up so well. The next question is, what is the final result of these stories? Are they published or stored at the Historical Society? And wrapping in another question, how many communities have you done?
Yeah, so how it's shared kind of depends on the community. We ask them to share it widely. They have ownership of the cultural asset map. Some of them print them up and hand them out at different places. Some, the document lives on, say, the Main Street website or the Chamber website, websites that already exist. It also lives on our Rethos web page. How they continue to use it is totally up to them. As for other communities, we're working in Willmar, Minnesota right now, and we're doing a sort of abbreviated version of this in 5 of our Main Street communities right now, for some strategic planning for them, but the Otter Tail County continues through next year. We try not to do too many at once because it tends to be pretty all-encompassing.
Yeah, and we just, the Otter Tail work started last summer, and our downtown assessment work also started last summer. So we haven't been doing it because it is based on the work that we did in the Twin Cities neighborhoods. in 2016. That was all wrapped up in 2018. And then we were working on, okay, how do we apply the same approaches and principles that we did there to rural communities in greater Minnesota? And that's when it started. So we haven't completely, those are like, so New Ulm and Litchfield are the two that have we've completed. And then we have, as Emily said, the other two. But I also wanted to note that how communities use this, because I realized I was like, Emily, I was gonna say, oh, we should add in an outcomes slide or something, in the ways that all the different possibilities are that this can be used. And again, it is up to the community, but our intention with the outcomes is that those activation strategies are implemented through, like if we're working with a local Main Street program, that they're implementing those strategies within their work plans and also in their strategic planning at the city level, when it comes to downtown, or at the Chamber of Commerce level. So you'll note that we mention chambers, like not as much as the Historical Society. So because the Main Street program, we do work with different downtown stakeholders. And so we tend to work with organizations like for example, the New Ulm one we did for the Chamber of Commerce, not the Historical Society there. Although the Historical Society was involved, that a lot of the times with these downtown assessments, we're working with the city. Like in Wilmer, we're working with the city on that.
I think that answers this question, at least in part. I'm just gonna make sure that I've covered everybody, but one question says, do you have any experience with the results of community asset surveys and how they can be incorporated or adopted into other planning documents like comprehensive plan, zoning, et cetera? And Serena, I think that you just answered that, but I wanted to make sure that I was doing my job well. Is there anything else y'all would like to say about that?
Yeah, I think these studies tend to align really well with other economic development studies that happen, retail surveys or other work that's being done to see what a district can support or what a community could support in terms of economic development. So in addition to historic and planning resources, it's really helpful in an economic development standpoint.
Thank you. And as I'm looking at our questions, I feel like we have covered everything that's here. John or Mike, do you see anything else I'm missing as I'm flipping back and forth? We are a few minutes over, and we really appreciate your time, ladies, for taking the extra few minutes to chat with us.
It looks like you got them all, Jenny. Good job.
Yes. Yep, it does.
Okay, well, I'm not sure what the official sign-off protocol is, but this has been very fascinating. Thank you so much for your time and answering all questions.
Thanks so much for having us. We're always excited to talk about this work.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's obvious in your enthusiasm. It sounds like some really amazing work.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day, and we hope to see you in our upcoming remaining sessions. Thanks.